all started on a late, quiet night. I'd been a truck driver for a few years now. After losing my previous job, I took what I could get, and trucking seemed like an easy enough gig. I mostly drove alone, hauling goods across long stretches of highway, just me and the road. It wasn't a dream job, but it paid well enough, and I was used to it by now. On this particular night, I'd been assigned a job out of nowhere. The dispatcher, an older guy named Roy, called me up and asked if I could handle a last-minute haul. The job seemed straightforward: pick up a shipment from a small warehouse on the outskirts of town and drive it through the night to a drop-off point on the other side of the desert. Roy handed me the paperwork when I arrived, his eyes scanning me as though he was sizing me up. "Make sure you lock up tight," he warned, handing me the manifest. "Don't stop, don't open it, and stick to Route 46. Got it." I nodded, wondering why he seemed so tense. I looked over the manifest, but all it said was hazardous cargo. I'd hauled all kinds of things before: chemicals, flammable liquids, equipment, so it didn't bother me. Roy's strange warning was what stuck in my head as I loaded up the truck, locked the back doors tight, and headed out just before midnight. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. I rolled down Route 46, surrounded by miles of desert on either side, the sky clear and full of stars. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the low buzz of the radio. It was peaceful in a way, but somewhere around 2 in the morning, things started to feel off. It began with a faint tapping sound, almost too quiet to notice. I thought it was just the truck settling, or maybe something shifting in the cargo. The tapping grew louder, becoming a steady knock, almost like someone was tapping from inside the trailer. My grip tightened on the wheel. I'd heard stories from other drivers about strange noises from the back, but I'd always chalked it up to paranoia. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the empty road ahead, but the sound wouldn't stop. Tap, tap, tap. The knocks became more rhythmic, like someone trying to get my attention. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone staring back at me. But there was nothing there, just the empty, dark roads stretching out behind me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the knocking stopped. I let out a shaky breath, telling myself it was just the truck. I must have imagined it. But then I heard something else, a voice, faint and distant, coming from the back of the truck. At first it was too quiet to make out, but it grew louder, more desperate. "Help me." I froze, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The voice was so clear, so full of pain, it sent a chill down my spine. I knew there couldn't be anyone back there. I'd locked the doors myself, but the voice continued, soft and pleading. "Please, help me." Against my better judgment, I pulled over to the side of the road. My heart pounded as I climbed out of the cab and walked around to the back of the truck. The desert air was cold and still, the only sound my footsteps crunching on the gravel. I reached the cargo doors, my hands shaking as I unlocked the latch. I hesitated, listening, but the voice had stopped. Taking a deep breath, I pulled the doors open. The trailer was dark and empty. I shined my flashlight around, but all I saw were crates and boxes, tightly packed and secured. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that the voice was just a figment of my imagination. I closed the doors, locking them tight, and climbed back into the cab, determined to finish the job and get the delivery over with. Back on the road, I tried to shake the fear clinging to me. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting something to leap out of the darkness. But the road was empty, the voice was gone, and the tapping hadn't returned. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just a fluke, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A while later, I noticed headlights in the rearview mirror. A single car was following me, keeping a steady distance. I sped up, hoping to lose it, but the car matched my pace. I slowed down, and so did it. My heart raced as the car's headlights blinked off, leaving the road behind me pitch dark. I glanced in the mirror, but the car was gone. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. By now, my nerves were shot, and the desert felt like it was closing in on me. The night dragged on, each mile stretching out longer than the last. And then, just as dawn was beginning to break, I saw a truck parked on the side of the road. Its hazard lights were blinking, and a man was standing next to it, waving me down. I slowed, pulling up alongside him. The man looked rough, his face worn and his eyes bloodshot. He nodded at me, glancing toward my trailer. "You're carrying the midnight cargo, aren't you?" he asked. I didn't answer, just nodded. He looked me over with a serious expression. "Listen to me. Whatever you do, don't look inside that trailer again. When you get to the drop-off, hand over the keys and leave. Don't ask questions. Just go." Before I could ask him what he meant, he climbed back into his truck and drove off. I sat there for a moment, watching him disappear into the distance, feeling more unsettled than ever. When I finally reached the drop-off point, it was a run-down warehouse at the edge of a dusty lot. 2 men in dark uniforms came out to meet me, their faces hidden under caps. One of them motioned for me to get out of the truck. I handed him the keys, my hands still trembling. "Any issues on the road?" he asked, his voice calm. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. He nodded, taking the keys and motioning for me to leave. I walked away, trying not to look back. As I reached my car, I couldn't resist glancing over my shoulder. The 2 men were opening the cargo doors, disappearing inside. For a split second, I thought I saw something moving in the shadows, a dark figure with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. But the doors closed, and it was gone. I quit trucking that same day, left the job behind. Whatever was in that cargo, I didn't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I still hear that faint tapping, a steady rhythm echoing in the dark, like something or someone trying to get out. Driving a truck isn't a job you do for the thrill. It's long nights, endless roads, and the hum of the engine keeping you company. I'd been a truck driver for years, but this haul was different from the start. I was called in last minute, late in the evening for a quick job. When I showed up, the warehouse was nearly empty. Only one person was there, Dan, the dispatcher, a quiet man in his late 52nds. He handed me the paperwork, his face looking tense. "Here's the cargo," he said, barely looking me in the eye. I glanced at the manifest. It just read, "Restricted cargo handle with caution." That wasn't too unusual. I'd hauled a lot of strange things before. Still, Dan's nervousness was strange. He looked around like someone might be watching us. "What's in it?" I asked, more out of curiosity than concern. Dan hesitated, then said, "Just don't open it, all right? Make sure you get straight to the drop-off point. No stops, no detours." "Got it," I said, shrugging it off. I'd had weird cargo rules before, like one time when I had to keep a load cold the entire drive or another that required no bumpy roads. This was no different, or so I thought. After I'd locked up and loaded everything, I climbed into the cab, ready to set off. It was about midnight, the stars faint above the empty road. Just me, my truck, and the long highway. I'd been on the road for about an hour when I noticed something. It was a soft noise, almost like scratching. At first, I thought it was just the usual sounds, things shifting in the trailer, metal groaning. But as I drove, the sound grew louder. Scratch, scratch. The noise was coming from the back of the trailer, but I told myself it was just something loose in the cargo. I kept my eyes on the road, cranking up the radio to drown out the sound. But the scratching continued, steady and soft, almost like someone or something was trying to claw its way out. It was hard to ignore after a while. Every bump made it louder, and soon it was a steady rhythm. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. "Just focus on the road," I muttered to myself. It was late, and maybe my nerves were on edge from the strange instructions. About 2 hours in, the scratching stopped. I let out a sigh, thinking maybe whatever had been moving back there had finally settled. But as soon as I relaxed, something else happened. I heard a voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere behind me. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The radio was off now, the road was silent, but the voice was clear as day. "Help. Mim." My heart skipped a beat. I tightened my grip on the wheel, staring straight ahead. There was no way I'd heard that, right? There was no one back there. It was impossible. But then I heard it again. "Help. Me." It sounded like a woman's voice, weak and desperate. I could feel my hands starting to shake. I wanted to stop, pull over, and check the back. But I remembered Dan's words, no stops, no detours. I kept driving, telling myself it was nothing. I even laughed a little, trying to shake off the fear. But the laughter died in my throat when I heard a louder knock from the trailer. This time, it sounded deliberate, like someone pounding on the walls, trying to get my attention. Bang. Bang. Please, let me out. The voice was louder now, filled with terror. I could feel cold sweat dripping down my neck. My heart was racing, and I had to focus just to keep the truck steady. I tried to ignore the voice, telling myself it couldn't be real. But how could I ignore something like that? The knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, like whoever or whatever was back there was getting desperate. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Against every bit of common sense, I pulled over to the side of the road, cutting the engine. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the soft ticking of the cooling engine. I climbed out of the cab, walking around to the back of the truck, every step feeling heavier than the last. As I reached the cargo doors, I hesitated. My hand was on the latch, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Just then, the knocking stopped. For a moment, everything was completely silent. I held my breath, waiting, my heart pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. And then, out of nowhere, I heard it again, a soft whisper coming from right behind the doors. Please, let me out. It's dark. Das so dark. The voice sounded closer now, almost like it was right next to me. My hands shook as I stepped back from the trailer, feeling a chill run down my spine. I turned and walked back to the cab, not daring to look back. Whatever was in that trailer, I didn't want to see it. I climbed back into the cab, locked the doors and hit the gas, pulling back onto the road as quickly as I could. I drove faster than I should have, my mind racing. I kept glancing in the mirrors, expecting to see something staring back at me, but the road was empty. The voice was gone, and the knocking hadn't returned, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The drop-off point was still a few hours away, and all I could think about was getting there as fast as possible. Just as dawn was starting to break, I spotted a truck pulled over on the side of the road. Its hazard lights were blinking, and there was a man standing next to it waving me down. I slowed, pulling up alongside. The man looked rough, his clothes dirty and his face pale. He gave me a serious look, nodding at my truck. "You're hauling the midnight cargo, aren't you?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, not sure how to respond. He looked over his shoulder at my trailer, then back at me, his expression dark. "Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. "Whatever you do, don't open it. When you get to the drop-off, hand over the keys and leave. Don't ask questions. Don't look back. Just go." I nodded again, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. The man didn't wait for a response. He just climbed back into his truck and drove off, disappearing down the road. I sat there for a moment, watching him go, before pulling back onto the highway, my mind racing. I reached the drop-off point just as the sun was fully up. It was a rundown warehouse at the edge of a dusty lot, surrounded by chain-link fences and piles of rusted machinery. Two men were waiting by the loading dock, dressed in dark uniforms and wearing blank expressions. They waved me over, and I parked the truck, climbing out and handing them the keys. One of the men gave me a nod, his expression unreadable. "Any trouble on the road?" he asked, his tone casual. I hesitated, not sure what to say. Finally, I shook my head, keeping my mouth shut. He nodded, motioning for me to leave. I didn't argue. I turned and walked back to my own car, parked nearby, my footsteps quick and heavy. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I glanced back at the truck one last time, just as the two men opened the cargo doors. For a split second, I thought I saw something inside, a dark shape moving in the shadows, something twisted and unnatural. But then the doors closed, and whatever it was disappeared. I didn't stick around to find out more. I started the car and drove away, leaving the warehouse, and whatever was in that trailer, far behind. I quit the job that same day. I didn't want to think about what I'd heard, what I'd almost seen, or the things I couldn't explain. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake in the dark, I still hear that faint scratching in my mind, that steady, rhythmic tapping, like something or someone trying to get out. Being a truck driver was never something I planned to do, but it paid the bills, and it let me see places I'd never otherwise see. Most of the time, the job was pretty boring. Hours and hours of empty roads, quiet nights, and the steady hum of the engine. That all changed one night on a job I'll never forget. It was late, around midnight, when my dispatcher, Jeff, called me. Jeff was an easygoing guy, but on the phone that night he sounded different, almost nervous. He told me he had an urgent job that had just come in, a delivery that had to be done right away. The pay was good, and he promised it would be a quick job, so I agreed without thinking much of it. I arrived at the pickup point, an old warehouse on the edge of town. The place looked abandoned, with broken windows and weeds growing around the loading docks. Jeff was there, standing next to the truck. He handed me the paperwork and looked me over as if he was trying to decide if I could handle it. I glanced at the manifest, but all it said was fragile cargo. That didn't give me much to go on, but I'd hauled all kinds of things before. Besides, the pay was too good to pass up. As Jeff loaded up the truck, he kept glancing at me, like he wanted to say something but couldn't get the words out. Finally, as he handed me the keys, he gave me a strange warning. Whatever happens, don't open the trailer. Don't stop unless you have to, and don't answer anyone who calls out to you on the road. Just get the cargo to the drop-off point, and everything will be fine. It was an odd request, but I just shrugged it off. Sometimes clients had strange rules for their shipments. I'd once driven a truck filled with fine wine where I wasn't allowed to stop for more than 10 minutes, no matter what. So, I climbed into the cab, waved goodbye to Jeff, and set off down the empty highway. The first few hours were quiet. The road was straight, with only the faint glow of the dashboard and the hum of the engine to keep me company. I'd driven this route a few times before, so I knew the roads pretty well. Nothing felt out of the ordinary until I heard a noise. It was faint, just a soft tap from the back of the trailer. I ignored it, telling myself it was probably just the cargo settling. But the tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, like someone was knocking from inside the trailer. I kept my eyes on the road, gripping the wheel a little tighter. I told myself it was just my imagination, that maybe the road was bumpier than I realized, but the tapping grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. I could hear it clearly now, and it sounded almost deliberate, like someone was tapping to get my attention. I turned up the radio to drown out the noise, but after a while, even that didn't help. The tapping was relentless, echoing through the cab, making it impossible to ignore. My nerves were shot, and I was starting to regret taking this job. I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something staring back at me, but there was only darkness, just miles of empty road stretching out behind me. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. I let out a shaky breath, relieved, and told myself it was just a fluke, maybe something loose in the trailer. But as soon as I relaxed, I heard something else, a faint, muffled voice. "Please, help ma'am." I froze, my heart pounding. The voice was weak, almost a whisper, but I heard it clear as day. I told myself it couldn't be real, that it had to be my imagination, but then it came again, louder this time. "Please, let me out." The voice sounded so desperate, so full of fear, that it sent chills down my spine. I wanted to pull over, to open the trailer, and see if someone was back there, but Jeff's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't open the trailer," he'd said. "Don't stop. Just get to the drop-off point." I kept driving, trying to ignore the voice, but it was impossible. It came again and again, each time more desperate than the last. "Help me, please. It's so dark." My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The voice was clear now, unmistakable. It sounded like a young woman, trapped, pleading for help. But how could that be? The trailer had been locked up tight, and I'd watched Jeff load it myself. There was no way anyone could be back there. Then I heard something that nearly made my heart stop, a loud bang, like someone was pounding on the walls of the trailer, trying to break free. The sound echoed through the cab, each bang louder and more frantic than the last. "Please, let me out." The voice was screaming now, filled with terror. I could barely keep my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to pull over, to open the doors and see what was back there. But fear kept me glued to my seat. What if it wasn't a person back there? What if it was something else? Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Against my better judgment, I pulled the truck to the side of the road, cutting the engine. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the faint rustling of the wind. I climbed out of the cab, my heart pounding as I walked around to the back of the truck. As I reached the cargo doors, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the latch. I wanted to open it, to see for myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was waiting for me on the other side. Then, just as I was about to pull the latch, the voice stopped. The silence was so sudden, so complete, that it felt like the whole world had gone still. I took a step back, feeling a chill crawl up my spine. I knew I should just get back in the cab and keep driving, but I couldn't leave without knowing. I took a deep breath, gripping the latch and pulling the doors open. The trailer was empty. I shined my flashlight around, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing there, just rows of crates stacked neatly against the walls. I checked every corner, every crate, but there was no sign of anyone. No woman, no voice, nothing. I closed the doors, feeling a mixture of relief and confusion. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the long hours and the empty road were getting to me. I climbed back into the cab, telling myself it was just a trick of the mind. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, determined to finish the job. But as soon as I started driving, the voice came back. It was louder now, more desperate than ever. "Please, don't leave me." I gritted my teeth, my hand shaking as I gripped the wheel. I didn't know what to believe anymore. The voice sounded so real, so full of fear, but I knew there was no one back there. I'd seen it with my own eyes. It was a nightmare. The voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, echoing through the cab until it felt like it was coming from all around me. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the road, but it was impossible. The voice was relentless, pleading, begging, screaming for help. By the time I reached the drop-off point, I was a wreck. My hands were shaking, my nerves shot, and I was drenched in cold sweat. The drop-off was a deserted warehouse on the edge of town, surrounded by tall, rusted fences. 2 men were waiting for me, both dressed in dark suits, their faces unreadable. I pulled the truck to a stop, climbed out, and handed them the keys. One of the men gave me a curt nod, barely looking at me. "Any trouble on the road?" he asked, his voice flat. I opened my mouth to answer, but I didn't know what to say. I just shook my head, unable to find the words. He nodded again, motioning for me to leave. I walked back to my car, my legs feeling like lead. As I reached the driver's seat, I glanced back at the truck one last time. The 2 men had opened the cargo doors, and for a split second, I thought I saw something move in the shadows. But before I could get a closer look, they closed the doors and disappeared into the warehouse. I got in my car and drove away, leaving the truck, and whatever was in it, behind. I didn't ask questions, didn't tell anyone what I'd heard. I quit the job the next day, wanting nothing more to do with that night, that truck, or those men. But sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the darkness feels like it's closing in, I still hear that voice, faint and desperate, echoing in the back of my mind. "Please, help him." Driving trucks wasn't something I loved, but it was what I knew best. Nights on the road can feel endless and dark, with only the headlights lighting the way, and the hum of the engine as my only company. Usually, I preferred it that way, quiet and simple. But there was one night, one delivery, that still keeps. It was a cold October evening when I got the call from my dispatcher, Ray. He sounded tense, and that was unusual. "I got a late job for you, Jack," he said, his voice low. "It's urgent, and it needs to be done by morning. Pays well." A late-night job was nothing new, but there was something off in Ray's voice, something that made me hesitate. "What's the cargo?" I asked. He paused before answering, and that pause didn't feel right. "Just a big crate. Fragile cargo, though, so you need to be careful. And one more thing, don't open the trailer. No matter what, just keep driving until you get to the destination." This wasn't the first time I'd gotten strict instructions, but Ray's voice didn't sit well with me. Still, I needed the money. So, I agreed and headed to the pickup point. An old loading dock on the edge of town, half hidden behind warehouses and barely lit by streetlights. When I arrived, Ray was there, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him. He handed me the paperwork, but there were no real details, just an address 2 towns over. The cargo was already loaded and locked in the trailer. "Remember, Jack," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "just drive straight, don't open the trailer." I just nodded, even though I was starting to feel uneasy. I climbed into the truck, started the engine, and hit the road. The first hour passed without anything strange happening. I kept to my route, the road stretching dark and silent ahead. I tried to brush off the tension, telling myself I'd done jobs like this before, but as I drove, an odd sound caught my ear. a soft scraping noise like something shifting in the back of the trailer. I told myself it was nothing. Things move around sometimes, especially if they aren't packed tight. But after a few minutes, the noise got louder. It was more of a scratching now, almost rhythmic. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It seemed to come from deep inside the trailer. I turned up the radio to drown it out. It worked for a while, and I managed to settle back into the drive, but the scratching sound came back, louder and more frantic. It was like something was alive back there, something desperate to get out. "Stay calm," I muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. I thought about Ray's warning, but the sound was getting to me. The scratching grew more intense, followed by what sounded like soft thuds, almost like someone or something banging from the inside of the crate. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something staring back at me. The mirror was empty, but the noise didn't stop. It was unnerving, echoing through the cab, making it impossible to ignore. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something or someone back there. After another hour of driving with that sound, I couldn't take it anymore. Against my better judgment, I decided to pull over. I parked on the side of the road, the night completely silent except for the soft ticking of the cooling engine. I climbed out, walked around to the back of the trailer, and stood there, hand on the latch, hesitating. Ray had said not to open it. But what if there really was someone in there? What if they needed help? I took a deep breath and pulled the latch, opening the trailer doors. Inside, there was a single large crate, strapped down and silent. I stepped inside the trailer, my flashlight in hand, and slowly moved closer to the crate. I felt a chill run down my spine. The crate was nailed shut, with chains wrapped around it tightly. Whoever had packed it didn't want it to come open. I stared at it, debating whether to open it, when suddenly the crate thudded, hard. I froze, my heart pounding, as the crate thudded again, shaking slightly as if something inside was trying to break free. The sound was deafening in the quiet trailer. I backed up, tripping over my own feet, and nearly fell out of the trailer. Just as I caught myself, I heard a voice. It was soft, almost a whisper, but I heard it clear as day. "Please, let me ooh." The voice was muffled but desperate, pleading. I could feel my skin crawl as I looked at the crate, not sure if I'd actually heard it, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. I took a shaky breath, staring at the crate. It was silent again, but I couldn't shake that feeling of dread. Who's in there?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. There was no answer, just a heavy silence hanging in the air. I backed out of the trailer, slammed the doors shut, and climbed back into the cab, locking the doors behind me. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my mind racing. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't about to open that crate. I took a deep breath, started the engine, and got back on the road, trying to focus on getting to the destination as quickly as possible. But as I drove, the voice came back, clearer this time. "Please, help, let me ooh." The voice sounded pained, pleading. I felt my stomach twist, but I kept driving, forcing myself to ignore it. I tried to tell myself it was just in my head, that I hadn't actually heard anything, but the voice didn't stop. "Please, it's so dark, let me ooh." It sounded so real, so close, like whoever, or whatever it was right next to me. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my heart pounding. I knew I should pull over, check again, but something deep inside told me not to. The miles passed slowly, and the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more desperate, echoing in my mind until I thought I'd go crazy. By the time I reached the drop-off point, I was exhausted, my nerves shot. The drop-off was a remote warehouse in the middle of nowhere. There were no signs, just an empty lot surrounded by woods. A single man waited by the loading dock, dressed in dark clothes and wearing an expression that told me he wasn't here for small talk. I pulled the truck to a stop, climbed out, and handed him the keys, trying to keep my hands from shaking. He looked at me, his face unreadable, and asked, "Any trouble on the road?" I opened my mouth to speak, but didn't know what to say. I thought about the voice, the scratching, the thuds, but in the end I just shook my head. He nodded, motioning for me to leave. As I turned to walk away, I glanced back at the trailer one last time. The man was opening the doors, his expression cold and focused. I wanted to see what was inside, to know what I'd been hauling all night. But before I could get a closer look, he waved me off, his eyes narrowing. "Leave," he said, his tone sharp. I didn't argue. I got into my car and drove away, leaving the warehouse and the trailer behind. But the sound of that voice, those desperate pleas, stayed with me. I thought I was free of it, but that night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard it again. "Please, let me." I didn't go back to the job after that. I couldn't. Every time I tried to get behind the wheel, I'd hear that voice, feel that chill crawl down my spine. Whatever I'd hauled that night, it wasn't something I wanted to know about. Some nights I lie awake, staring into the darkness, wondering what was in that crate, wondering if it was still there, locked away in some forgotten warehouse, waiting. And in those moments, I hear the voice again, faint and desperate, echoing in my mind, pleading for someone to listen. "Please, help MML. Let me out." I'd been trucking for years. Endless highways, late nights, and strange towns became my routine. I thought I'd seen it all, until one delivery that would haunt me forever. I got a call from dispatch about an urgent job, a last-minute load that needed to be taken 100 miles through winding back roads and delivered by morning. The money was good, so I took it without much thought. The pickup location was on the edge of town, at a rundown warehouse that looked like it hadn't seen much activity in years. When I got there, a man was waiting beside a single large crate. He was tall and thin, wearing a long coat and a black hat that cast shadows over his face. He looked at me, his eyes cold, and nodded. "You're the driver?" he asked in a flat tone. I nodded, uneasy. He handed me a stack of papers, barely glanced at them before noticing one line that read, "Do not open under any circumstance." The man caught me staring. "You don't need to know what's inside," he said in that same cold voice. "Just make sure it reaches its destination." I thought about asking questions, but his look told me that he wasn't the type to answer. I loaded the crate into the trailer, locked the doors, and started the long drive out into the night. The first few miles were uneventful. I kept to my route, with only the sound of my engine and the hum of the road to keep me company. I tried not to think about the crate or why it was so important not to open it. But after an hour on the road, things started to feel off. I heard a faint noise from the trailer, a soft scraping sound, like something shifting in the back. I figured it was just the load settling, but then it happened again, louder this time. It sounded almost like scratching. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the noise. But as I drove on, the scratching grew more persistent. It wasn't like any cargo shifting I'd ever heard. I glanced in my side mirror, half expecting to see something unusual, but all I saw was darkness. Another hour passed, and I couldn't ignore the noise anymore. The scratching had turned to a low, rhythmic thumping, like something was knocking from inside the crate. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was just an old crate, nothing to worry about, but something inside me was starting to get scared. I kept driving, forcing myself to focus on the road, but then the thumping grew louder, more frantic. I could hear it through the walls of the cab, echoing in the empty darkness. And then, just as I was about to pull over and check, I heard something that made my blood go cold, a faint voice. "Let me out." It was soft, almost a whisper, but I heard it clear as day. I froze, gripping the wheel tight, my eyes locked on the road ahead. My mind raced. Was it my imagination? I hadn't slept much in the last few days. Maybe I was just tired. But then the voice came again, louder. "Please, let me out." I didn't want to stop. I remembered the instructions, "Don't open the crate," but the voice kept calling out, begging, pleading. It sounded like a woman, her tone full of fear and desperation. My heart pounded as I drove, trying to block out the sound. But the voice wouldn't stop. "Please, it's so dark. I'm scared. Let me out." Each word echoed in my head, growing louder and more desperate. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I pulled the truck to the side of the road, turning off the engine. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the soft rustling of the trees in the night breeze. I climbed out of the cab, my hands shaking as I walked around to the back of the trailer. I stared at the locked doors, my mind racing. Every instinct told me to walk away, to leave the crate shut and get back on the road. But I couldn't ignore the voice, the fear in her words. I had to know. I unlocked the doors and swung them open. The trailer was dark, the shadows deep and eerie. I shone my flashlight inside, my heart pounding as I stepped up into the trailer. There was the crate, large and sealed tight with chains wrapped around it. The wood was old and splintered, and as I moved closer, I heard the voice again. "Please, help me." It was coming from inside the crate. My stomach twisted. I hesitated, looking at the chains and the heavy lock. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep it shut, but I couldn't leave her in there. I reached for the lock, hesitating for a split second, then pulled it open. I slowly lifted the lid, my hand shaking as I opened the crate. But as soon as I looked inside, I froze, horror spreading through me. The crate was empty. There was nothing there, just darkness, deep and endless, like looking into a void. But the voice was still there, echoing in the empty crate. "Thank you." The voice sounded different now, almost mocking. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I backed away, stumbling out of the trailer, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I slammed the doors shut, locking them tight, and ran back to the cab. My mind was racing, my heart pounding, and I didn't know what to think. I started the engine and pulled back onto the road, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. I didn't care about the delivery anymore, I just wanted to get away. But as I drove, the voice came back, whispering from somewhere in the darkness. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice was all around me now, echoing through the cab, growing louder and more sinister. I could feel a presence behind me, watching, waiting, and no matter how fast I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I didn't stop. I drove through the night, desperate to escape whatever I had unleashed, but the voice never left, haunting me with every mile. By the time I reached the drop-off point, dawn was breaking, but I felt no relief. I climbed out of the truck, feeling drained and hollow. 2 men were waiting for me, dressed in dark suits with cold, unreadable faces. "Did you have any trouble?" one of them asked. I opened my mouth to answer, but all I could do was nod. They exchanged a look, and one of them walked to the trailer, unlocking it and swinging the doors open. He peered inside, his face emotionless, and then he turned back to me. "Thank you for your service," he said, his voice flat. "You may go now." I didn't argue. I climbed into my car and left, not looking back. But that voice, that desperate mocking voice, never left me. I heard it in my dreams, whispering from the shadows, calling out from the darkness. Even now, I can still hear it sometimes, a faint whisper in the dead of night. "Thank you for letting me out."